what if the reason you're so, exhausted by your spiritual life isn't because you aren't trying hard enough, but because you've been furiously knocking on a door from the inside?
Oh, that is, it completely reframes the entire concept of spiritual fatigue, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because we are so conditioned to believe that exhaustion is just the baseline. Like, if you aren't tired, you just aren't doing it right. But the author here is suggesting that the fatigue itself is actually the first symptom of a, well, fundamentally flawed approach.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a genuinely paradigm-shifting approach to an age-old topic today. And we're focusing exclusively on the foundational ideas laid out in the preface and chapter 1 of a fascinating 2026 book called The Art of Prayer by Steadman.
Right, just the preface in chapter 1 today, setting the groundwork.
Exactly. So whether you're commuting right now, prepping for a meeting, or just, intensely curious about the architecture of human spirituality, we are jumping straight into the deep end. Because the author doesn't start this book from a place of triumph or, victory. He starts from a place of utter, crushing defeat.
Yeah, he explicitly states that this text is not for the prayer warrior who has it all figured out, or the confident pastor leading a massive congregation. He wrote it for the weary.
For the exhausted.
Right. The vulnerability in the preface is striking because he systematically deconstructs his own past struggles, which I think validates a kind of hidden shame a lot of people carry. He describes trying absolutely everything to make prayer work.
Oh, the laundry list of methods he goes through is so relatable. I mean, he read all the books, learned the methods, followed the formulas, waking up at dawn, using a prayer list, working through the ACTS acronym. You know the one, right?
Oh, yeah. Adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication.
Right. He's doing all of that. Praying the scriptures, sitting in silence, shouting, whispering. He treated it like trying to find the exact right combination to crack a safe.
Let's look at the psychological mechanics behind why we gravitate toward those methods in the first place, though. Because human beings inherently crave structure, especially when dealing with the abstract or the invisible.
Yeah, we like steps 1, 2, 3.
Exactly. Acronyms like ACTS give us a metric. They give us a sense of control.
Yeah.
If you feel like your relationship with the divine is murky, a formula provides a checklist. You can say, well, I spent 5 minutes on adoration and 10 on supplication, so I have successfully completed the task.
Check and check.
Right. But when you map a transactional task-based psychological framework onto an intimate relationship, it eventually collapses. When the shouting doesn't work, maybe the God you're trying to reach prefers a whisper. When the mourning doesn't work, maybe the formula is broken. The psychological toll of treating a relationship like a performance metric is just devastating.
And he describes that toll perfectly. He says he felt like a child standing outside a locked door, knocking and just never sure if anyone was even home.
That image is so heartbreaking.
It is. But wait, I want to pull on this thread for a second. Because aren't discipline and formulas supposed to give us necessary structure? Like if you want to master a language or learn an instrument, you need a framework. You need repetition. So why do these formulas fail so spectacularly in this specific context?
That's a great question. There's a vital difference between scaffolding and a cage.
Okay, I like that. Scaffolding versus a cage.
Right, because scaffolding is meant to support you while you build something organic. Once the building can stand on its own, the scaffolding comes down. But in the spiritual framework Steadman is critiquing here, the formula often becomes the goal. The scaffolding becomes a cage.
You're just maintaining the scaffolding.
Yes. You aren't building your relationship anymore, you are just maintaining the metal pipes. And the text points out that the worst part of this wasn't even the perceived silence of God. It was the internalized guilt.
Oh, absolutely. Every missed 5:00 a.m. alarm wasn't just a missed opportunity. It morphed into concrete evidence of his own spiritual failure.
Every distracted thought became proof of his lack of devotion. Every unanswered prayer became a massive existential question mark over his entire faith. When you operate in a purely transactional system where input must equal output, a lack of results always points back to a lack of sufficient effort on your part.
Which creates this toxic, self-feeding loop.
Exactly. Striving, followed by exhaustion, followed by profound shame.
That dynamic reminds me of a common phrase you hear, where prayer is called the engine of the Christian life. Have you heard that?
Oh, countless times.
Right, but reading the author's experience in the preface, he's describing someone furiously turning the key in the ignition of a car that has absolutely no gas in the tank. The engine won't turn over, but instead of checking the fuel line, the driver just keeps turning the key harder and harder, blaming themselves for not having a strong enough wrist.
That is a brilliant analogy. You can turn that key with all the discipline, fervor, and acronyms in the world. But if the underlying mechanics are fundamentally disconnected from the fuel source, you are only going to wear out the battery.
Yeah, and you're going to feel terrible doing it.
The tragedy is that the author assumed this exhaustion was just normal. He internalized the idea that the spiritual life is actually supposed to feel like a grueling, unrewarding second job.
Just think about a time when a deep passion of yours turned into a rigid checklist. Maybe it was a hobby, a fitness goal, or even a relationship where the initial joy of the activity was completely eclipsed by the heavy sinking obligation to just perform it correctly so you wouldn't feel guilty.
That baseline of "I'm just not doing enough"
Yeah.
is the exact emotional state the author is starting from.
And from that absolute bottom of weariness, Steadman introduces the pivot. Because if the formulas and the anxious driving are the problem, the solution cannot possibly be to just find a better formula.
Right, you don't need a new acronym.
No. The solution has to be a fundamentally different understanding of the entire system.
And he says he didn't encounter a different message, but a deeper one. He calls it a deeper encounter with the gospel itself. The shift isn't about what he is doing. It is entirely about where he is positioned.
Position. Okay, break that down for us.
Well, he moves from the traditional understanding, which is that Jesus died for our sins, a concept he completely affirms as true, to a staggering, deeper revelation of identity. He realizes that the text also claims the believer died with him, was buried with him, was raised with him, and is currently seated with him in heavenly places.
The word "with" is doing so much heavy lifting in that sentence.
So much. It changes the geometry of the entire concept. It moves the locus of control. Steadman quotes Philippians 2:1-13 here, noting that the same apostle who says, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling," follows it up immediately by saying, "It is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure."
So it's not me doing all the work.
Exactly. The realization here is that the Christian life isn't about an individual's anxious striving for God, but rather God striving in the individual.
Let me translate this into a technology framework to see if the mechanics hold up. Because what he's describing isn't just downloading a new, more efficient prayer app on your phone to get better results. This is a complete operating system overhaul.
An OS overhaul.
Yes. Like in the old transactional system, you are the device trying to ping a distant server in the cloud. You're hoping your signal is strong enough, hoping the weather is clear, hoping the server isn't down. But in this new understanding, you aren't reaching out to a cloud server at all. The server is running locally. It's pre-installed.
Oh, that is spot on. The spirit of intercession, as Steadman writes, is not a distant reality to be attained through good behavior. He is a person permanently indwelling the spirit of the believer. Recognizing this local server, to use your analogy, forces a complete teardown of how someone approaches the practice of prayer.
So where does that teardown start?
Well, the preface lays out 4 major shifts, starting with the move from transaction to participation.
Right. Because in a transaction, the motives are inherently self-preservational. I give you an hour of my morning, and in exchange, you give me a peaceful day, or you protect my family. It's a bartering system.
And bartering requires distance and separate ownership. I have my goods, you have yours. But participation is fundamentally different. Steadman argues that the prayers of Christ aren't a model to be imitated from afar. They are a reality to be participated in.
You are joining a conversation that is already happening inside you.
Yes. The pressure to initiate the dialogue vanishes, which naturally cascades into the next shift, moving from duty to delight.
From duty to delight, that sounds like a massive emotional pivot.
It is. We can view this through the lens of attachment theory, actually. Duty in a religious context is almost always driven by an insecure or anxious attachment to the divine.
Because you're afraid.
Exactly. It's driven by a fear of consequence. If I don't do this, I will lose favor or I will be punished. Delight, on the other hand, is the hallmark of a secure attachment. It is driven by the joy of union. When you realize the pressure is off, that you don't have to manufacture the spiritual energy from scratch to keep the relationship alive, the heavy obligation just evaporates.
Wow. And that also requires shifting from begging to beholding, right? The text emphasizes this heavily.
This is perhaps the most psychologically profound shift Steadman introduces. Consider the psychological posture of a beggar.
Okay.
A beggar is fundamentally defined by lack and distance. They are outside the establishment, looking at someone who holds all the power to either give or withhold based entirely on whim or mood. The beggar must carefully craft their pitch, use the right tone, and look pitiful enough to warrant sympathy.
It's exhausting just thinking about it, having to curate your whole vibe just to hopefully get a scrap.
Right. But Steadman argues that a believer is not a beggar trying to reach a distant throne, but a son or daughter already seated with Christ on that throne.
That is huge.
When you are seated on the throne, you don't beg the king for scraps. You behold the reality of the kingdom you are already a part of. You survey what is already yours by inheritance.
Shifting your identity from a beggar outside the castle walls to an heir seated in the throne room completely alters human psychology. The baseline anxiety of, will I have enough to survive today, just vanishes. The panic of needing to use the exact right theological words to appease the monarch is gone.
It completely eradicates the core driver of spiritual anxiety, which leads to the final shift outlined in the preface. Treating prayer not as a bridge to cross, but as an atmosphere already breathed.
A bridge implies a gap. It implies a chasm between you and the divine.
And if there's a gap, the burden is entirely on your shoulders to build the bridge. You have to gather the materials, do the engineering, and lay the planks. But if prayer is an atmosphere you already breathe, there is zero construction required. You just have to open your lungs.
Just breathe.
As Steadman writes, the door is not locked. You are not outside. You have been inside all along.
I mean, this identity shift sounds beautiful in theory. But here's where things usually break down for people.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right. Because how does a person who realizes they are seated on the throne actually operate when the rubber meets the road? When they are faced with a real-world, terrifying problem, does this theology hold up? This leads us right into chapter 1, where the author takes this lofty concept and applies it to tangible reality.
And he does so with a claim that directly challenges traditional religious paradigms. Chapter 1 asserts that the fullness of God's power, the exact same power that raised Christ from the dead, is currently at work in believers.
Not will be at work someday in the future. Is at work right now?
Present tense, yes. Therefore, Steadman argues, when you encounter sickness, you don't beg for healing. You release the healing power of God that already resides within. When you encounter lack, you don't pray from a place of poverty. You speak from the fullness of Christ.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on the practical application of this.
Go for it.
If I'm facing a massive, terrifying crisis, let's say a sudden layoff, my bank account is at absolute zero and I can't pay my mortgage. How do I practically speak from fullness instead of begging for help? The biological reality is that my amygdala is hijacking my brain, sending me into total fight or flight mode. Doesn't speaking from fullness just feel like psychological denial? Like I'm just pretending the eviction notice isn't taped to my front door.
Honestly, this is where the book gets incredibly difficult to apply, because Steadman is asking us to override our most basic, hardwired survival instincts.
Right.
If this were just positive thinking or like manifestation, yes, it would absolutely be psychological denial.
Right, just pretending it's fine.
But Steadman isn't advocating for ignoring the eviction notice. He's talking about cultivating a conscious awareness of a deeper reality that supersedes the immediate crisis. He calls this the path of the mystic.
Oh boy, the M word. Mysticism carries a ton of historical baggage. People hear that and immediately picture someone floating cross-legged in a trance, completely disconnected from reality.
Oh, absolutely. So let's look strictly at how the source material defines it, stripping away all that pop culture baggage. Steadman quotes Abba Isaac, one of the early Desert Fathers, who simply said, "Prayer is the contemplation of God."
That's it. Contemplation.
That's it. In the context of Chapter 1, being a mystic doesn't mean abandoning reason or ignoring your mortgage. It means engaging in a restful participation in the life of Jesus. It is a daily, conscious awareness of your union with Christ.
Let's ground this with a psychological comparison. Imagine a billionaire who leaves their wallet in a taxi.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
They have zero cash, no credit cards, and they are temporarily stranded in the city. They might be annoyed, sure, but they don't have a panic attack. They don't fall to their knees begging a stranger on the street for a loan.
Right.
Why? Because even though they are experiencing a temporary acute lack in that specific moment, they possess a conscious awareness of their overarching net worth. They know the resources exist even if they aren't currently in their pocket.
That is a highly effective way to understand the mechanism here. Because the billionaire isn't in denial about the lost wallet. They were simply viewing the lost wallet through the lens of their broader financial security. Steadman is suggesting that a believer can view an acute crisis, like an eviction notice, through the lens of their absolute union with the infinite resources of the Spirit.
So you aren't ignoring the empty bank account. You are actively choosing to be more aware of the infinite resources within you than you are of the external lack.
Exactly. And the text emphasizes that this awareness isn't a magic trick you pull out only when the car breaks down. You don't just suddenly summon billionaire energy out of nowhere. This awareness is fueled by what the author calls a life of consecration.
Well, we need to redefine consecration as well, because the traditional religious understanding of that word usually implies asceticism, giving up everything enjoyable, self-flagellation, or proving your devotion through misery so God won't be angry with you.
The text explicitly warns against that legalistic view. Consecration is not a transactional giving up of material things to earn spiritual merit points. It describes it as an organic pouring out of our lives because we are completely overwhelmed by love.
Overwhelmed by love, not fear.
Right, it's an inside-out reality. Steadman contrasts this with a moral struggle to be like Jesus, advocating instead for a restful participation in the life of Jesus.
That phrase, restful participation, is so key.
The mechanism of restful participation is crucial. When you speak from fullness during a crisis, you aren't trying to muster up enough psychological faith to convince a reluctant God to drop a bag of money from the sky. You are resting in the reality that you are already united with the source of all provision, and you are releasing that reality into your circumstance.
You are, as the text phrases it, releasing the aroma of Christ simply through your presence.
Exactly.
Wait, if we pull this theology to its logical conclusion, we hit a massive paradox.
Let's hear it.
If we already have this power, and if the work is truly finished, and if God is already perfectly pleased with us because we are seated on the throne, why open our mouths at all? I mean, why not just sit back in silence and do absolutely nothing?
It is the ultimate question of grace, and it's a trap many fall into. Steadman tackles this paradox head-on by discussing the consequences of what he calls a silent tap.
A silent tap. Chapter 1 notes that many people who profess to know the truth of Christ's finished work actually end up completely neglecting prayer. They adopt this kind of passive fatalism, like, well, it's finished, so whatever happens is God's will. I don't need to ask for anything.
Right, but the author lists very specific consequences for this neglect: spiritual dullness, spiritual weakness, and spiritual dryness.
So it does matter.
It matters immensely.
Yeah.
The crucial element here is how the author frames these consequences. In the old transactional model, if you stop praying, God gets offended by your lack of attention and actively punishes you with weakness or dryness. It's a punitive system.
Like getting grounded.
Exactly. But Steadman makes a vital distinction. Prayerlessness is not a legal crime that triggers divine retribution. It is a spiritual starvation that inherently hinders the believer.
Let's step away from the old cliches and use a biological analogy. Imagine a deep-sea diver connected to a surface ship by an oxygen tether. The ship has an infinite supply of air.
Okay, I like this.
If the diver pinches the tube closed, the crew on the ship doesn't get angry. They don't call the underwater police to arrest the diver for breaking the law of breathing. The diver is simply going to suffocate. They will become disoriented, weak, and eventually lose consciousness. Prayer isn't a tax you pay to the surface ship to keep them happy. Prayer is the act of keeping the oxygen line open.
That's brilliant. When you neglect prayer, you aren't severing your union with God, just as the diver is still physically tethered to the ship, but you are blocking the channel through which God's power flows into your daily conscious experience.
You're pinching the tube?
Right. You become, as Steadman writes, insensitive to the promptings and leadings of the Holy Spirit, which is the spiritual dullness. You become vulnerable to the pressures of your environment, which is the weakness. And you become barren and unfruitful, which is the dryness.
You are functionally starving yourself while sitting at a banquet table.
And the text points out that the early church intuitively understood this. They devoted themselves daily to prayer and fellowship. They didn't do this to appease an angry deity or to meet a quota. They did it to maintain the flow of that supernatural life.
Because they needed the oxygen.
Exactly. They recognized that to live a supernatural Christian life in a hostile environment, the oxygen line must remain unpinched. As Steadman writes, referencing the biblical epistle of James, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man makes much power available. The power is there, but the flow must be maintained.
But maintaining that flow requires a very specific posture. And, according to the author, the effectiveness of this entire system, this mechanism of resting and releasing, hinges entirely on how we view the one we're actually talking to.
The audience matters.
Huge. Which brings us to the closing arguments of Chapter 1, the Our Father paradigm.
Steadman points out a foundational moment here. When the disciples asked Jesus to teach them to pray, He didn't hand them a new esoteric formula or a rigid protocol of petition. He started with identity. He said, when you pray, say, Our Father.
Our Father. That single phrase changes the entire geometry of the relationship.
It moves prayer permanently beyond the traditional religious notions of delay, denial, distance, and separation.
The 4 Ds of religious anxiety: delay, denial, distance, and separation.
Religion, as Steadman analyzes it, inherently teaches us to pray to a God who is out there or up there. It establishes a spatial and relational divide.
Like, we're way down here in the dirt, he is up there in the clouds, and we have to shout loud enough or be good enough to just catch his attention.
Right. It's a servant-master dynamic, or at best, a creature-creator transaction. But Christ introduces a father-son or parent-child communion.
And there is 0 distance in that communion. The text contains this incredibly profound line that really completely reframes the mechanics of the practice. He writes, prayer is not a ritual to invoke the presence of God. Prayer is the awakening to his presence within us.
The awakening. You aren't calling him down from the sky. You are waking up to the fact that he is closer than your own breath.
If we look at the psychology of human relationships, think about the difference between begging a stranger for a critical favor versus asking your loving parent for help.
Oh, it's night and day. Begging a stranger requires you to prove your worthiness. You have to explain why you deserve their time. It creates immense anxiety and exhaustion.
Because you don't know if they're going to say yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But resting in the knowledge that you are already loved, that you already belong to the family and have access to the family resources, creates an unforced, joyful conversation. Steadman calls it a sweet fellowship of the Spirit, a joyful dance of intimacy with Abba Father.
A joyful dance. That imagery is so far removed from the weary, defeated author we met in the preface, crying on the floor because he missed his alarm and felt like a spiritual failure.
It's a total transformation.
And there's another line here I want to explore because it feels like the thesis statement of this entire paradigm shift. Steadman writes, faith is not about chasing the gift. It's about living from the giver.
That's a powerful distinction.
It is. How does abandoning the anxiety of chasing actually change the way a person lives their daily life?
Well, it reorients your entire psychological motive. When you are chasing a gift, whether that's healing, financial provision, or just peace of mind, your focus is entirely anchored on your lack. Your brain is obsessed with what you don't have, which keeps you in a state of chronic stress.
You're always focusing on the empty hands.
Right. But when you are living from the giver, your focus is anchored on the abundance that is already yours by virtue of union. You aren't trying to persuade a reluctant deity to be generous. You are fellowshipping with him and aligning your mindset with his nature. You are, as the text says, speaking forth and declaring the Father's will from a position of authority, not desperately begging from a place of fear and anxiety.
Think about your most secure foundational relationship. Maybe it's a spouse, a sibling, or a lifelong best friend. You don't have to constantly perform to keep their love. You don't have to use highly formalized, archaic language to ask them to pass the salt at dinner.
Right, you don't write an essay to ask for a favor.
You just exist together. You communicate from a place of secure attachment. That is what the author is arguing the architecture of prayer is actually meant to be.
It is the ultimate shift from an insecure, anxious attachment style with the divine to a perfectly secure attachment. The heavy lifting is finished. The spatial and relational distance is closed. The door was never locked to begin with.
Let's take a breath and look back at the incredible ground we've covered today. Because we started in the preface with the crushing, relatable weariness of transactional prayer, the formulas, the guilt, the exhausting feeling of standing outside a locked door trying to earn access.
We then explored the profound identity shift of the deeper gospel, the realization that we aren't just transacting with the divine, but are united with Christ, participating in his life, seated with him in the heavenly places.
Then we looked at the path of the mystic in Chapter 1, understanding that we are called to release the power already within us through restful participation, rather than begging for it from afar.
And we unpacked the danger of spiritual starvation when we pinch the oxygen line, before finally anchoring it all in the Our Father paradigm, abandoning the anxiety of distance for the joyful dance of unbroken intimacy.
Steadman is proposing a complete teardown and rebuild of the spiritual operating system. It moves the believer from outside the house to inside the throne room.
It really does change everything.
To close our time today, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've talked a lot about the author's assertion that prayer is the awakening to his presence within us.
Right.
If True prayer is simply an awakening to a God who is already completely present inside you. How does that fundamentally change the way you experience absolute silence?
That's a profound question.
Could it be that the moments when you are on the floor, totally exhausted, and you have absolutely no words left, could those actually be your most profound moments of faith? Because in that complete silence, you are finally done trying to build a bridge you are already standing on.
You're finally just letting the engine rest.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the formulas, keep seeking out these deeper layers of understanding, and most importantly, take a moment today to just breathe. We'll catch you on the next one.